Danny Heinrich, the man who confessed to kidnapping and killing Jacob Wetterling, will be sentenced to prison a week from tomorrow.
And it will close a sad and grim chapter in Minnesota history, but there's one part of the story that has yet to be fully told. It's about the man who may have had a big influence on Danny Heinrich.
Tom Lydon of the Fox 9 investigators has been looking into this man who was also a suspect in the Wetterling case for many years, Tom.
Yeah, it's really interesting. They were really parallel suspects for most of the 26 years, but they had a very interesting relationship between them, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. His name is Duane Hart, and he's about 15 years older than Danny Heinrich. Hart is a sexual psychopath who had dozens of victims. Some believe he may have had more than 100. Tonight, you will hear from two of those victims who believe the relationship between Hart and Heinrich would play a key role in the Wetterling case, right up until the very end.
With its rolling hills and placid lakes, there is a rustic serenity to rural Stearns County. The manicured farms and Norman Rockwell's small towns. A sense of normalcy that seduces, even as it deceives. For how could such an awful person come from a place like this?
I think that you're supposed to forgive everybody, and that's one person, the only person that I don't think I can forgive. He had a little camp down here, and he always had his fish house down here.
For years now, Brad Frolick and Dan Garvik have gone back to the secluded, secret hideouts of their childhood.
Yeah, this is his road.
Like this spot on the shores of Lake Coronis, where an old fish house once stood. It's one of a half-dozen places they've dug up looking for the remains of Jacob Wetterling, while excavating their own past as well.
Were you both molested down here?
Yes.
Oh yeah, many times.
Hundreds of times.
As children, they were both sexually assaulted hundreds of times by this man, Duane Hart, known as Dewey. This is Hart's mugshot from 1990, arrested 3 months after the Wetterling kidnapping. Frolick and Garvik testified against Hart and sent him to prison.
He fed us dope and alcohol, and he would get us messed up. And
They say Hart would molest several children at a time, preying upon broken families.
Duane Hart would come along, and if you were a single woman with some kids, he'd pretend he liked you, maybe take you out once on a date, and then that would be it.
he would clean house, he would cook, and we'd take us fishing, and he'd bring fish home. And my mom and Gary thought he was such a wonderful guy. And
He was really grooming you.
yes.
On a $50 bill when you're 9, it's like, that's a lot of money when you're 9 years old. So, you know,
he would offer money
yeah, that's how it got started.
and alcohol and drugs.
And then, yeah, after the money, then the drugs and alcohol.
And they were not alone. According to court records at the time, Hart committed hundreds of sexual assaults on at least 10 young boys, ages 8 to 15, coercing them with alcohol and marijuana, moving between the sleepy small towns of Belgrade, Haywick, New London, Eden Valley, St. Joseph, and Painesville. Investigators believe there may have been dozens of victims over 3 decades. The Fox 9 investigators have identified 30 suspected or confirmed cases. One of them, a quiet loner of a boy named Danny Heinrich, who would grow up to become the man who has now confessed to kidnapping and killing Jacob Wetterling.
Do you believe Duane Hart also molested Danny Heinrich?
I do.
Do you think Duane Hart taught Danny Heinrich these things in some ways?
Yeah, that's exactly what he did. He instilled it into Danny, and it made him the person he is.
In the late 70s, Duane Hart briefly dated Danny Heinrich's mother, who lived at the Black Saucer Hotel in Painesville. Danny Heinrich was only 15 years old at the time. Last year, Heinrich's older brother, David, talked to Fox 9's Paul Bloom about Hart.
And you were one of his victims?
Yes, there's so many in this town.
Garvik and Frolick remember Heinrich and Hart being inseparable and disappearing together. They assume going to one of Hart's secret locations. They say Heinrich was almost like Hart's shadow.
I look at Danny Heinrich, everything he did was just like Duane Hart. The police scanner, the knives for throwing knives. I mean, just.
Hart told people he was a tunnel rat in Vietnam, an explosives expert who climbed through enemy tunnels. Hart remains a suspect in the bombing of a post office in Kimball 40 years ago. The intended target, a detective who'd busted Hart for check fraud and animal cruelty. Today, Hart is indefinitely incarcerated at the sex offender program in Moose Lake. Whereas recently as 2 years ago, the lead detectives in the Wetterling case got a search warrant for his mail and phone calls, saying he was still a viable suspect in the Wetterling kidnapping and the assault of 8 boys in Painesville.
But the reality is the MO was never even close to the same, and it never fit.
Robert Dudley is the author of Finding Jacob Wetterling. He says Hart was a groomer who coerced his victims with alcohol and marijuana, while Heinrich, we now know, was a violent abductor. Hart knew as much back in 1990 when a private detective working for his defense attorney interviewed him, taking 25 pages of notes. Hart identified 24 of his own victims, including one who he thought kidnapped Jacob. The detective even circling the name, Danny Heinrich. But Hart told the private detective Heinrich was an adult at the time, and the relationship, he says, was purely consensual.
Well, here you have Duane Hart, a fairly notorious pedophile, telling a private detective, I didn't kidnap Jacob Wetterling, but I think this guy, Danny Heinrich, did.
Yes, that's a fact.
What do you think Duane Hart's role was in creating Danny Heinrich?
I think he ultimately he was responsible in other ways. I mean, he was the beginning of the cycle of abuse for Danny Heinrich. The next person, so someone that he abused, goes on to do even more horrible things to children.
A cycle that may have come full circle. The final secret spot Frolic and Garvik wanted to show us is a place just outside Painesville.
Right in this area.
Yeah.
Back in them tree lines, right back there.
A place where Garvik says Hart would assault him and other children.
Just, this right in this area, he took me more than several times, probably 15, 20 times.
A place now considered hallowed ground, because it's also where Danny Heinrich buried Jacob Wetterling, where Jacob remained for 26 years.
And you believe it's no accident that Danny Heinrich brought Jacob Wetterling to this spot?
Absolutely not.
Where Duane Hart brought you?
No, I believe that Danny was here with Duane numerous times. I believe that Duane molested Danny right in this very close area many times.
It is a bitter irony that all these years they were searching the right places, but for the wrong suspect. That the man who molested them, the man they were sure kidnapped Jacob, had a role no one had really bothered to consider. That the molester Duane Hart could also be a mentor, creating a monster in his own image.
It's hard to believe that this vicious monster was loose in our community for so long, and everybody knew about him, but nobody stepped up to the plate to do anything to protect the children. It's really hard to believe.
It is hard to believe. How is Hart able to get away with it for so long? Keep in mind, though, this all happened in the 70s and 80s in small towns. As a society, we know so much more today about pedophiles and their repeated patterns over time. Hart, who is now 69 and incarcerated at Moose Lake, has declined our repeated requests for an interview. But guys, we may soon learn a lot more about Duane Hart. That's because Stearns County Sheriff's Department is preparing to release the entire Jacob Wetterling file, the entire investigative file, obviously very large, and I'm told a good chunk of that file includes information about Duane Hart. So we may learn a lot more about him soon.
But after listening to these men, you can't help but it is hard to believe that it took this long to get answers for the Wetterling family.
And I think for all the talk about Jacob Wetterling, one of their points is that there are a lot of other victims. This is really an expanding circle of victims. And when you start talking about Duane Hart, you were talking about dozens.
And it took a lot of courage for those men to come
Sure
forward and
did.
do that interview.
Absolutely.
With you.
All right,
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.